We have Jim Kraft, the Senior Advisor for the Office of Personnel Management Software Manager at OPM. We have Dr. Corbett, Dr. Eric Corbett, a research scientist for the Responsible AI and Human-Centered Technology at Google. We have Jasmine Falbert. She's a Senior Principal Systems Engineer at MITRE, and I will be serving as the moderator. So for our first question today, with AI chatbots and other emerging technologies that have been developed and released over the last year, these are really changing our everyday life for many people. As new technologies emerge, what role will civic technology play in building trust throughout communities? I'll pass this over to Jim. You can start us off.
All right, thanks. Well, I actually want to go to some of the big issues. Like any technology, civic technology can be used either for good or for evil, either to increase trust or decrease trust, actually, depending how it's used, depending how the population is able to understand and see the effects of that technology. We're dealing with a privacy versus no privacy question. Some people still believe that privacy is a defense against others manipulating their lives against their wishes. On the other hand, if speed and quality of service increase radically so that people don't have to deal with mind-numbing bureaucracy and slow response to need, then it probably increases trust. So the real question is how the technology is going to be used. And a case in point of how it could be misused is sort of the Chinese approach to social credit, which is tied to their smart city initiatives, and how that technology, which is tracking citizens ostensibly to make a better life for them, in fact becomes very restrictive if you happen to end on the wrong side of the line. And an example of how you can get sucked in unknowingly is, for example, the genetic software such as 23andMe is actually centrally stored in China, from what I understand. And if you know the genetic patterns of relatives, then they know your genetic pattern, and there becomes ways that people are tracked. Wherever they go, they touch things and leave things behind. Forensic science is increasing to such a degree. So I think the real question is, how are we going to put controls and how are we going to have transparency that actually will increase trust, and what sorts of things will tend to decrease trust? I'll pass it on. We got to go kind of fast. We got 5 questions and 3 speakers.
Yeah, I agree. Thanks, Jim. Eric, I know that you work quite a lot in this field with your work and your doctoral work prior to joining Google, and then of course Google has a lot of the same type of concepts that they're reviewing. What is your opinion on the first question?
Yeah, so before I answer that, I have to legally say that I'm speaking on in an individual capacity and not on behalf of Google or Google Research. For legal purposes, my counsel has advised me to provide that disclaimer. So with that disclaimer in place, as long as we're all cool with that, I will say, yeah, I think, as it pertains to this question of trust, you have to be careful that we're thinking about, we're not letting technology distract us from the very basic building blocks of what does it mean to trust in a human to human relationship. I think, like, despite all of the advances that we have at this point in society, trust still remains, a very basic human concept, which is, this sharing a mutual vulnerability, and and the expectation that even though I make myself vulnerable to you, that I will not, be harmed um, through the expression of that vulnerability, right? And that's a very human thing that we can get away from with technology. And I think that in many cases, especially when it comes to civic tech, like most sort of applications, when we think about trust and think about the role of technology and creating trust, it gets built into a sort of customer service relationship and making existing structures more efficient and faster, which can, do three things to trust, right? It can actually end up displacing humans, right? Which are the fundamental building blocks of trust. It can build upon existing technological structures that are already inequitable, thus exacerbating existing distrust from certain, populations or demographics that are already disconnected from government. And then we can just end up creating a sort of false sort of relationship and trusting in technology or trusting in systems. Despite my position, I actually don't think you can trust technology, right? Technology is until it becomes a sort of a general intelligence, right? Difference between narrow artificial intelligence and general intelligence. A technological system has no moral ability. Therefore, it doesn't make sort of sense to talk about trust as it relates to a system. So I think, I guess the answer to the question is to sort of don't get distracted from the basic building blocks of human to human trust.
Well, thank you so much, Eric. Our second question is about really setting the concept of, this pandemic that we are just coming out of has really highlighted how citizens interact with federal, state, and local entities using different technologies. What impact has technology had on providing services to the American public that build trust?
Yeah, so let me just start. And first off, I'm glad you reminded me, Eric. I'm speaking in my own personal capacity based on what I've seen my whole career. For any lawyers, I do not represent any acquisition initiatives. I have no money, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So let me just say there's no commitment to the government for anything I say. That being said, I will say that my observation is organizations like OPM actually have a massive interaction with the public and have been using civic technology before we identified the term and came up with the concept. I mean, we reach probably 3.5 million federal employees, a vast number of retired federal employees that we deal with. You've got health insurance, you've got whatever. And in fact, the entire American public, just about, tribal governments and everything else have access to USA jobs looking for federal employment. So, I mean, there's vast interactions. And let me just load on something with Eric. One of the ways that we build trust is to make sure we keep people integrated with how the technology is used on both ends. So the population goes, but at some point they want to know that there's a human being who cares and has a moral center that is going to make sure that the technology is not abusing people. And usually everybody wants some way of getting help when it looks like the technology is stymieing their ability to access government services or to deal with government. So keeping human on the loop at both ends of the technology is probably critical. So I would say technologies that we're using include big data. We're starting to get into robotic process automation. There's a lot of things being built into the software that we are buying. And to correct, I'm the enterprise software manager. My main job is I'm a senior advisor to the office of the CIO. A lot of the developers, both small firms and large firms, are integrating some of the newest technologies, and it's transparent to the users and even to the people who are running that software. I mean, the code is so vast and complex, the algorithms so deeply put in that sometimes you don't understand. And one of the things with trust for technology is you have to have it where the user thinks at least they understand it enough to know that the technology is not going to abuse them, right? I mean, and that, you know, you can trust a power tool if you know that tool is reliable and will do, even though you know there's dangers with that power tool, you can trust, you know, a chainsaw or whatever to do its job if it's well built, doesn't break down, has a good track record. And if you are communicated to what the dangers are in using that tool or that software, you know, this is the thing you have to be careful of. How do you protect your own privacy in the midst of using these technologies? You know, what things can you do? So I believe I get kind of pumped up by this whole topic, so I'll turn it over to.
Yeah, thanks, Jim. Jasmine, you have worked with MITRE on a really interesting blockchain project that really delves down to some of these trust issues. Can you talk a little bit more about your opinion and some of the stuff that you have been working with MITRE?
Sure, and sort of to draw connections to things that Eric and Jim talked about. When we started the project, we actually didn't start with the idea that blockchain was a great idea or the answer or the technology that was needed. What we started with was what were the human problems we were trying to solve. And in the case of our project, because it's grants related, we were focusing on, you know, the small local grant recipients and what are the challenges they're facing and where technology could help them. And as both of these guys said, one of the things we learned as we worked through the project was, sure, distributed ledger technology actually would solve a number of the problems. But one of the things we spent a lot of time working on in parallel with figuring out how to make the distributed ledger technology solve the administrative burden problem and the transparency problem that the federal government has with grants is all along the way. We spent a lot of time looking at what we called solution adoption challenges, and it was around data access, integrity, and use. And so it was like, you know, balancing a scale, right? How are we gonna connect all of the small nonprofits all the way through the middle tiers to the federal government so they could get their money faster and have less burden reporting their results? But at the same time, like both guys said, how do we decide, well, when does the nonprofit provide their information? Do they have control over when they provide the information into the distributed ledger? Can they decide when the information goes in? Once the information goes in, how do we assure them that the information is protected and only the appropriate people see the information in the distributed ledger that need to see it up through the grant chain, let's say from the local to the state to the federal level. So it was all along the way, we had to pay attention to both sides of the coin, making more information available faster and more completely to everybody in the chain, and also at the same time protecting the rights and integrity of the people whose information it was.
Great, wonderful. Thank you so much, Jasmine. Our next question is, what is the role that citizens have for ensuring that emerging technologies are used in a safe and ethical manners? And how can technologists build technologies that support this? How about Eric, since you work in this this area for research?
Oh, wow. Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. Well, you know, I guess at a basic level, from the government side, right? Like there is a tendency to sort of, at least from what I've seen, to take a very sort of you know, top-down sort of system-centered approach to you know, designing and using technologies. Think about like so much of the smart city stuff is, you know, driven from a top-down, you know, business to government sort of relationship, and then the you know, the user, in this case, the citizen is sort of, you know, shoehorned into something, or sort of an afterthought, or we're making a lot of assumptions about what it is that they might need. And you know, don't speak on behalf of Google, but we do have one phrase, one thing that we sort of we're sort of famous for, which is follow the user, and all else will, you know, will make sense. Like if you begin with the user. So I think the, you know, you have to adopt like a very, you know, strong user-centered design philosophy. And like user-centered design is a, you know, a way of developing software. It's a software development methodology, right? Opposite of waterfall method. However, it's also an ideology, right? It's a perspective. It is sort of, there's a sort of a moral sort of framing around this that is important to adhere to too, I think. And, you know, to the extent that people are even aware of these systems, where they are, if in their like local governments or in these state and federal level systems, is you know, a lot of times people aren't aware until things go wrong, right? Like you know, we see so many things with automated decision-making systems used in local government, are you know, a welfare agency using a risk assessment algorithm, and then, you know, turns out, oh, it's racist, or like it's, you know, it's we trained it on data that was, you know, racist for 20 years, and now lo and behold, the algorithm's now racist, right? Like even these kinds of, you know, people are often not aware that they're even interacting with systems. So I think to the extent that we're not being risk adverse, say we, when I'm talking about us as a society and a government, not Google, and sort of being open and inviting people to that table of thinking about the ways in which technology can serve their lives, even through, you know, minor user-centered design things can end up, you know, shifting the conversation. But I think the onus is really on the people within government to adopt that philosophy and sort of work from that point.
If I can jump in there, looking at the chat, I saw a comment on profiling, okay? And it really brings to mind that technology can be used either to oppress people or to free people. And one of the things that I would say is the same tools that can be used to profile and almost automatically inject bias into, say, an employment section can also be used to identify when bias is occurring and seek to counter it. I mean, so, you know, again, what we have to really look at is how do we keep people in the loop, and how do we make sure that those people are engaged and accountable for the actions that they do using the technology. I'm saying the people that actually control it, and how much do they, how much is that transparent, and is the voice of the people heard and actually responded to? I mean, one of the initiatives I thought was very good that seemed to have died out is under the Obama administration, there was something where the White House, where people could petition to get an answer from the White House. And if you had 25,000 people, I think it was, then they said that they would give you an answer. And at the time there had been the data breach, which exposed my whole life to some really bad people. And I was very concerned, you know, everybody that was a relative and everything from kindergarten on. And, you know, that became a petition, and eventually there was a response. So the question is, does this collaboration and new communications mechanisms let the voice of the people be heard to the point where they know they're being heard and it has a positive impact, that they're being listened to and potentially responses? So I think these tools have greatly helped. I mean, even VTCs, the fact that if I have somebody that needs to deal with a department who's in the public, I potentially can have it where they can look me in the eye, even though I'm in Washington and they're in a tribal area, you know, a tribal nation. So these technologies enable us to do it. But again, we have to make the investment and people have to make the decisions. And there has to be some accountability and transparency for trust to increase. Does that help? I mean, does that answer the question? I hope I am. I mean, these are kind of serious, deep philosophical issues we're dealing with. You know,
Yeah, I
think that
completely
helps.
agree. And our last question, which will go around to each of the speaking guests today and ask this, but this is much more philosophical, but what are the key principles or ethical considerations organizations need to take into account today as they begin using emerging technologies for civic tech? Let me go first to Jasmine and let her respond.
One of the
to that.
principles we followed in the project that we did using distributed ledger technology was that the information that's coming onto the ledger belongs to the person who originated the information. And the fact that others have access to it is because they've been granted access. So keeping in mind that as a small nonprofit, my financial information, my performance information, information about payments, information about my audit results, all of that is my information as the small nonprofit. And so when it gets put on the ledger, just because it's on the ledger doesn't now mean everybody should have access to it. We need to think through really who should have access to it. And then when I think my information needs to be updated, how do I make it easy for me to update my information? So it's really, you know, it's keeping in mind who the real owner of the information is. And just because it's out there doesn't mean everyone should have access to it.
All right, thanks you so much, Jasmine. Eric, if I can, I'd like to go to you next. And this is what are the key principles or ethical considerations organizations need to take into account? Yeah, I mean, what is your kind of key things that you think are most important?
Oh, so now I'll plug some of my dissertation research. This is great. You've
All that
been a
investment
tripwire here.
pays off.
Make sure you cite me. No, so I have sort of written sort of prolifically about this concept of distance, psychological, social distance, the distance that can exist in relationships between people and their government. And it's counterintuitive to think about technology as creating more distance, but in many cases it will or can if you're not careful, if you're not thinking about technology from a relational standpoint. So I'll give you one great example of this. And I went to grad school in Atlanta, and Atlanta was sort of slow in getting their 311 systems up. So, you know, if you're familiar with these in local government, it's like a call, you can call it, and it's a one-stop sort of shop to access all of the local government services. So, you know, hey, something's wrong with my pothole, something, you know, I have a pothole, something's wrong with my water bill, or, you know, I'm trying to find this, you know, service in the city. And so, you know, you implement this system, you're like, oh, well, this is great technology. It's great. We're going to, you know, create more services are going to become faster. Government's more efficient. We all love this. You talk to some of the council people, and, you know, some of their reactions to the system is like, well, that's all great. But, you know, before we had it, like we really used to, you know, have these really sort of deep ingrained relationships with our, you know, with these neighborhoods. We knew what was going on. You know, we could start a conversation about a pothole, but then it would lead to something else, you know, people really could put a name to a face. And it was like just those basic sort of inefficiencies of government, right? And just being able to talk to someone, you know, talk about this and shoot shop. That's what really ends up closing distance, right? It brings us closer, right? Through those little mundane sort of interactions. I think, like, you know, so as we're moving, and this is, 311. Now we're in a space where we're talking about, ChatGPT and all kinds of new generative AI systems. I think the danger, especially on the civic side, is, are we thinking about how these technologies are, creating more distance between, people and their government, or are they closing distance? And if you're thinking about the design of technology from a relational standpoint, that can guide you in a way that will really make you focus on, is this thing bringing us closer? Is it bringing us further apart?
Well, if I may, also sometimes people want the distance. I mean, to give you an example, I've just turned off my video. The technology really allows me to personally engage at a higher level of intimacy. But I will tell you, I go to meetings in my organization where we've got 100 people on VTC, and most everybody's got their camera turned off. And they'll talk with their camera turned off. So the point is that, they're teleworking at home, and we've had this problem with the school, the remote learning during COVID, where people, Johnny has to get on, and he's at the only place they can have, and all of a sudden there's something in the background. I'm in a rural area. People have a gun rack and their deer rifles, and we got bears running around where I live occasionally. So, but there's been plenty of cases where the school sees, oh my gosh, there's a gun in there. And because of their cultural view, or there's two swords hanging, on there because the guy does medieval stuff, he goes to Renaissance fairs. And, all of a sudden the school goes hyper because the kid, an elementary child is in there and there's a sword hanging on the wall. And all I can say is, if people feel controlled by the technology, the trust will diminish. If they feel they're canceled or not listened to, trust will diminish. If they feel that they have a voice and that the other side is accountable and there are protections, maybe we need a new additions to the Bill of Rights. Maybe we need, we have the Privacy Act of 74 and whatever, but maybe we need to codify it in such a clear way that everybody in our country understands these are the immutable protections you have not to be manipulated. And I think, the Twitter files actually did more to destroy trust because it confirmed what people were suspecting in many cases. And I think we have to reverse that. We have to go against that. We have to feel that we're not manipulated by the technology, and there's human beings who care and are accountable if they in fact in any way hurt us with that technology. And we're at a pivotal point. We don't want to be like China. We don't want social credit. And the opportunities, I mean, I tell you, I used Google ever since the beginning. MITRE Corporation has helped in other organizations I've been in to think through some of these deeper issues. But there are some deep philosophical issues that nobody, I think, is clearly articulating a way forward or a vision that is compelling. And that's kind of what I'm hoping we'll see in the future. And maybe this working group will be the spark that sets the world ablaze with some new, exciting, useful ideas.
Well, thank you so much. I really want to express our gratitude to all of our speakers today, Jim, Eric, and Jasmine for their time and their fascinating kind of opinions on this, and we do recognize that it's just your individual opinion, not representative of your organizations. We are going to have a discussion